Something quite unexpected but exciting happened a couple of weeks ago, and that is I went viral on Twitter for the very first time. Now, I'm not overly active on Twitter. I do use it to keep up to date on chatter in the publishing industry because a lot of editors and agents use Twitter quite frequently. I occasionally throw up a tweet here or there, so you can imagine how shocked I was when a thread I posted based on one of my former videos got nearly 200,000 views and hundreds of retweets. Since it seems like the topic of this thread, which I mentioned was also a video from earlier this year, seemed to resonate with a lot of people, I thought, hey, why not do a little bit of a deeper dive into this topic based on some of the responses that I got on the thread. People brought up some great points and clarifications and extra tips, so I want to bring all of that to you today. Now, if you're new here, every week we either talk about the craft of writing, particularly if you're working on a novel, or I give insights into the publishing industry, as my background is working in editorial at Big 5 publishing houses. So if any of that interests you, please join this amazing community by subscribing. While you're at it, please hit that thumbs up button. It really helps out my channel. And if you are an author who has a work in progress, I recommend hopping into the description and grabbing my free story self-assessment worksheet. This is a resource I designed especially for my YouTube viewers that includes a fun, easy quiz that is supposed to help you see your story from a different perspective, seeing what you're doing really well in it, as well as what you could improve on the next iteration. Downloading it is going to sign you up for my newsletter where I publish exclusive interviews with publishing insiders and traditionally published authors, and that's growing quite amazingly on its own too, so you really don't want to miss out on all of the great insights they're bringing to the table. If you want to go straight to the newsletter, the link is also in the description. Okay, first I want to show you the thread, especially for anyone who didn't watch my video that it is based on. Here's one mistake I see in almost every novel I edit. Too much narrative distance or space between the reader and the characters/events in the story. Here are 3 ways you could be creating narrative distance and weakening your manuscript without even realizing it. 1. Recounting events in retrospect. This removes the reader from the present plot action and can feel like an info dump. Often, the narrative will be more engaging if you show the event as a scene when it actually occurs. Show us the character's emotional response in the moment. 2. Not illuminating characters' thoughts. In first or close third-person POV, we should typically have near full access to the POV character's mind. Look at what happens externally and internally/emotionally for your character in each scene. Show us how they react and interpret the action. 3. Withholding info from the reader. Having your protagonist explicitly keep secrets from the reader creates narrative distance and can cause readers to disengage. Unless you are deliberately crafting the story around the reveal of the secret, we should know what they know. And then I have a little summary. 3 ways narrative distance could show up in your novel: recounting events, not illuminating the POV character's thoughts, withholding info from the reader. Try closing the narrative distance. It nearly always makes your story stronger. So if you haven't seen my full post on narrative distance, I'm going to link it in the description here, but you basically just got a summary of it in the thread. Of course, I'm able to go a lot more in depth in a 10-minute video versus a few hundred words in the thread. But today I wanted to cover some things that I didn't necessarily put in my first video or didn't have the space to do in my thread either. Clearly the topic of narrative distance is interesting to at least the Twitter writing community, so I thought I would expand a bit. The first thing I want to talk about relates to the first point about recounting events in retrospect. So let's talk about flashbacks versus retrospection. I got some responses to the thread that said, well, what if I want to incorporate flashbacks? Then am I recounting events and creating narrative distance? Is that bad? The answer is no. Flashbacks are totally different from what I am saying is recounting events in retrospect. So let's talk about recounting events. This is essentially when we skip over a scene that occurred within the timeline of the novel. We didn't see it play out. We see the characters at some future point in time, and then they reference it, even though that event happened in the same time frame as the novel itself. Basically, we just didn't see it in scene. This can create narrative distance if that event was actually consequential enough to warrant showing it unfold in real time in the story. When you summarize an event that is particularly consequential for the characters, or there's a lot of emotion involved, then it can feel strange to only hear the characters say, oh yeah, we talked to that character about X, Y, and Z yesterday. And you're like, wait, hold up. You didn't put that in the story. Why didn't we see that conversation happen? That's creating narrative distance. It's different from a flashback. Because we want to be following the characters and the events of the story very closely, it feels strange for us to not have been there when that actually happened, right? Now, a flashback is totally different. A flashback is an event that happened outside of the context of the novel. So if the novel opens when a character is 13 years old, the flashback might be when they're 5 years old, right? It is not happening within the time frame of the actual narrative. Flashbacks are totally fair game and do not necessarily create narrative distance. They help you flesh out a character's backstory, their motivations, their personal values, their worldviews, their relationships. They are so helpful for enriching your characters. The key is just to make sure that the flashbacks don't go on for too long, such that we lose sight of what's going on in the actual present plot action of the main narrative. I have a whole other video that goes into flashback do's and don'ts, so check that out if you want some more tips on flashbacks specifically. The next point I want to clarify about narrative distance is how you actually tactically show characters' thoughts in the narrative. I mentioned in the thread and in my former video that it is important for the reader to have near full access to the POV character or narrator's minds. If they're thinking something or feeling something, we should know about it, because that's what makes us feel intimately connected to them and ultimately get emotionally invested in them. But how do you tactically go about incorporating these thoughts and feelings and emotions into the narrative? In first person, it's easy enough to just show the inner dialogue that's going through their head in the narrative itself. So that could look something like, I watched as Luke carried a heavy-looking box out of the window. What the heck was he doing? I attempted to find a plausible explanation for why he'd be out at 2 a.m., but came up with none. We're seeing exactly how this character is reacting to Luke carrying the box out of the window. In their head, the thought goes, what was he doing? And then they're contemplating finding a reason why he might be doing this at 2 a.m. But even if you're writing in close third person rather than in first person, you can still use this same exact technique. The only difference in close third person is that you differentiate what's going on in the POV character's head by putting it in italics and using first person present tense. So let me read you the same paragraph written in close third person instead. Riley watched as Luke carried a heavy-looking box out of the window. What the heck is he doing? That's in italics. She attempted to find a plausible explanation for why he'd be out at 2 a.m., but came up with none. You see how we still get the exact same information, the exact same access to the characters' minds, even in third person. We still see them think, what the heck is he doing? In both versions. It's just how you actually present it to the reader on the page that's different. There was one interesting response to the Twitter thread on this point about getting inside the character's mind that basically asked why contemporary publishing is so interested in stories that get inside the character's head so intimately. And they asked, why can't there be stories that have a more detached approach and maybe we don't know everything that's going on inside the character's head? My response to that would be, we need that access to the protagonist's mind to feel close to them, to actually be invested in what happens to them. We ultimately turn to stories to feel some type of human connection and share in an emotional experience, right? So if the character is not being vulnerable with us or showing us any type of emotion or thoughts, then it's gonna be really hard for us to have that connection, and it's not likely that we're going to feel that invested in the story. What ultimately makes for the most powerful and emotionally moving stories is understanding the emotions of the characters, right? And the easiest way to do that is to show us those emotions, what's going through their head, and giving us that intimate access to them. The last point I want to bring up relates to my thoughts on not withholding information from the reader, which creates narrative distance. I wanted to give you a bit more of a framework surrounding when to withhold information and when not to, because I understand how this might be confusing, because of course you need to withhold some information. You can't tell the reader everything you want them to know about the main character in the first 5 pages. In fact, please don't do that. That's going to overload and overwhelm the initial scenes of the story, which are so critical for hooking a reader and getting them invested in the story. That's gonna feel like an info dump. If you just tell us everything about the character's backstory, their life, their job, their friends, right? So you do have to withhold information strategically. So for instance, perhaps you have a main character who has a conflict with their parents. You reference that they're not close with their parents in the opening chapter of the novel, but you don't tell us exactly why that is the case. That's completely fine. The reader will be happy to wait a little bit to learn more about what caused this conflict with their parents, right? But by the second or third time this conflict or this tension with the parents is mentioned in the narrative, that's the point at which I want you to take a moment and explain to the reader why there is this tension. Don't withhold this as a secret that we don't find out until the end of the novel, unless that is the point of the novel, for us to find this secret. But if this is just a piece of backstory, a piece of information about the character, we should know it early in the story. Not necessarily on the first or second page, but early within the story, within the first few chapters. So think about your own story and make sure that you're not waiting too long to reveal important facets of your character or your novel's circumstances. Remember that by the second or third time you're making a kind of veiled reference to something, the reader is going to want a deeper explanation and deeper insight. So you do want to take a moment to reveal everything to catch them up to speed and not withhold that information. This relates to a video I did on exposition, do's and don'ts, so if you struggle with exposition at all, definitely check that out. I want to close by just saying thank you so much to anyone who promoted the tweet and helped me reach this viral status that I was not expecting. It really means a lot to me, and I'm really glad we got to do a deeper dive on narrative distance. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave me a comment here if there are any other craft areas you want me to explore more, either in a future YouTube video or in a Twitter thread. And make sure you check out my full video on narrative distance if you haven't already. Before you head out, please go ahead and hit that thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and remember to grab your free story self-assessment and check out my newsletter link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.